Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets, from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Greetings and welcome, Gary. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast. I remember the last time we spoke was back in 2020, another election year, and here we are 4 years later, talking about an election that looks as wild in many ways as back in 2020.
Well, it's very good to be back with you again. I can't believe it's been 4 years since we talked last. And I also can't believe that the two contenders for the presidency in 2024 are the same people who ran for it in 2020. But here we are.
Yeah. Well, maybe what we can do is we can start with something about the Biden years. Now, obviously, you don't just look at sort of the contemporary sort of picture. You have a good sense of the historical sweep as well. So how would you characterize the Biden years? What have been sort of the key differences with Trump? And how would you situate the Biden presidency from a historical perspective?
Well, I think on balance, Biden has had a good presidency. He's had major legislative accomplishments with the slimmest majority in Congress and now with no majority in the House. He's had three major packages of legislation that together amount to a coherent project to rebalance the relationship of the state to markets. And what I mean by that, he came into office as a Democratic president, determined to go in a somewhat different direction from both Obama and Clinton, who I see as being under the neoliberal tent. The neoliberal tent referring to the core idea that markets are the key to prosperity and the job of government is to assist markets where they need help, but to otherwise get out of the way. And this had been the dominant ideology in the United States, really since the years of Ronald Reagan. Trump broke with that in some respects, but did not really have a coherent set of policies to put in place to replace the neoliberal order. And in that one sense, I think Biden followed in Trump's shoes in the sense of also breaking with the neoliberal order, but having a much more coherent sense of how to build a different kind of political economy in the United States. And if we look at his three major pieces of legislation, there's the Green Energy Act, misnamed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest investment.
I always thought that was a massive misnomer there.
Yes, it was done for political reasons. We can talk about that later if you want to, if we have time. It's the biggest investment the government has ever made in green energy, and about $400 billion. There's a $1 trillion infrastructure bill, the largest set of investments in physical infrastructure since at least the 1950s, when Eisenhower was building the interstate highway system, and perhaps since the 1930s during the halcyon days of the New Deal. And then a reshoring of chips manufactured to the United States so that the U.S. would become less dependent on Taiwan as a supplier in the event that China chose to invade Taiwan, with chips being identified as an item of national security. That government had to take steps to make sure that those kinds of commodities, which are essential for the whole IT industry, would be available on a continuous basis. In all three cases, he was using government money and power to direct private industry in certain directions. And that's what I mean by rebalancing the relationship of markets to states. The idea undergirding the Biden presidency is that markets could no longer be left alone to their own devices. They had to be directed, channeled in a certain direction, both for reasons of national security in the case of chips, and also so that the people who constitute American society would have what they need in terms of public goods, with infrastructure being a prime example of a public good that all Americans, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, need: roads, bridges, dams, new forms of electrification, all sorts of things. And also the IRA, the Green Energy Act, has the potential to redirect a substantial portion of American industry to a green energy future. So this is ambitious. It's coherent. It's been relatively successful. Of course, it takes time for these investments to take root. Biden has gotten remarkably little credit for it, even before his woes of the last few months. I think already near the end of last summer, before Hamas's invasion of Israel, his approval ratings were in the high 30s, which indicates not a great deal of level of support. Even though he was successful in this area and also successful in managing the economy in what could have been a very difficult transition coming out of COVID. If you look at the signs of the economy now in terms of its welfare, unemployment under 4%, quarterly growth rates between 3 and 5%. I think in the third quarter of 2023, the U.S. economy reached a growth rate in excess of 5%, matched by virtually no other economy in the world. He did make a mistake on inflation in terms of overheating the economy, but given the circumstances that he was facing in terms of an economy that had literally been shut down by government action for the sake of saving lives, how do you start it up again? I would have erred on the side that he erred on. And he's also engineered a soft landing so that inflation is now between 2 and 3%, near to the targets set by the Fed and the other people who keep the financial character of the American economy in good shape. So all these point to a rather successful economic program and a rather successful economic stewardship. And it's not just about prosperity, but it's also about rethinking the relationship of government to the private economy, looking for
and actually on that in particular, you wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, where you make this point about, the Reagan sort of period up until, say, the end of Obama and beginning of Trump as that sort of period. Number one, is this a global phenomena that we have this neoliberal order and it's now transitioning away from that? And then second, how enduring will this be? I mean, could there be a resurgence of the neoliberal order? Because after all, markets are very powerful.
Markets are very powerful, and the institutions that support them are still very powerful. I'm not sure where we're going to end up on that score. There is a possibility of rebound. But I think that the world is emerging from that neoliberal era into something else. And not just because of political beliefs about the appropriate relationship of markets to states, but also because of other considerations, climate being one. What does the world have to do to reorient economies so that life is still livable on this planet in 100 years? And also, I think the COVID experience made it clear that there are going to be instances, either climate-induced or war-induced or plague-induced, where long supply chains encircling the world are going to be vulnerable in ways they were thought not to be vulnerable before. And also the contestation in the seas around Israel now, with the Houthis interrupting the flow of materials into contested waters, is another example of how long supply chains can be disrupted. So every nation has had to think, what materials, what resources, what goods does our country need in order to take care of the fundamental needs of our citizenry? And if they are coming from far away, and if they are being exposed to vulnerable trading routes, maybe that's not good enough. And that line of thinking, which is about national security more than partisan political advantage, leads to arguments for greater government involvement in setting certain guidelines for how the economy ought to operate. And so that makes me think we are moving into some kind of different era. But I acknowledge your point about the power of international finance and the power of corporations that have the ability to shape markets to their own liking, most prominently in high tech and the power of certain high tech firms. And so I don't think the future has been written in stone, but I do sense that much of the world is now moving in a different direction.
And actually, on sort of big tech, I was going to ask you about the attempts by the Biden administration to try to deal with some of the big tech companies on an antitrust basis. So that's, that relates back to this relationship between the government and private markets. I mean, how do you think the administration fared on that front?
Well, the commitment was certainly there, and he put in charge of the Federal Trade Commission Lina Khan, a Columbia professor of law, whose road to fame was about the need to break up Amazon because it had become too big a corporation and violated the principles of antitrust and anti-monopoly that are both written into law in the United States and written into the American heritage. The strong conviction that if corporations got too large and too dominant, it would deprive people of their liberty and should not be allowed to continue to exist. So there's been a very concerted effort to revive the older anti-monopoly tradition away from what we might call the Bork era of trust and antitrust. And this is Robert Bork, the jurist who almost got to the Supreme Court but did not. But nevertheless, his jurisprudence has been very influential. His argument about trust was as long as big corporations were delivering goods to people at the cheapest possible price, their size and market share didn't matter. It was inconsequential and ought to be ignored. And so that legitimated the rise of these enormous corporations. And what the Biden administration has done is to try to move to an earlier conception of antitrust, that once market share has gotten to a certain point, bad things are going to happen for the people and the economy. And those circumstances have to be changed through breaking up big corporations or less radically forcing them to hive off portions of their industry. So the effort has been concerted, but if you ask what have the results been so far, barely noticeable, even though antitrust has created some unlikely bedfellows. Josh Hawley, very conservative Republican senator from Missouri, has had friendly conversations with Lina Khan, the antitrust in the Biden administration. Who would have thought that was possible under any circumstances, despite the C.D. Vance has been working with Elizabeth Warren on breaking up the big banks, another conservative Republican with a very progressive Democrat. Who would have thought that was possible? But if you ask what are the results of this been, they're barely discernible. I think some of this has to do with the complexity of actually breaking up a corporation, the size of a big bank or the size of Amazon or the size of Google, and how much preparation that takes. And then given that the high-tech companies are now the most powerful corporations in America and in the world, they swarm Washington with their lobbyists, and they swarm representatives and senators with their donations. So it's a very hard battle to fight, and I don't think it has yet generated enough popular anger to counterbalance the lobbying influence of these high-tech corporations. So I would say this has been a major project of the Biden administration, but thus far has yielded almost nothing.
And I guess this will be one to watch to see this transition away from the neoliberal order, I suppose. How important is this within the thesis that we are moving away into a different relationship?
Well, I don't think it's crucial for moving away from neoliberalism to get to this point. But I do think this is where a second term for Biden could make an enormous amount of difference. Whereas the antitrust part of this, if Trump were to be reelected, I think would be pretty quickly abandoned.
Yeah.
So I think it's the moving away from the neoliberal project doesn't rise and fall on this, but the Biden administration has been very committed to it, and so far, unlike his other initiatives, it simply is not working.
And you mentioned
it hasn't yielded enough results. I shouldn't say it's not working.
Yeah. I mean, it's a long-term project, I imagine. You mentioned the second term of Biden. I mean, what do you think would be some of the signature initiatives he would have if he were to have a second term?
Well, I think antitrust would intensify. He may well have another appointment to the Supreme Court, which could make an enormous difference in terms of rebalancing the conservative and liberal factions on that court. And it would give time for the projects of the first term to settle in and begin to yield dividends. In other words, if you imagine infrastructure, reshoring of chips manufacture, creating a green economy, if you imagine these matters 5 years out from now, one can imagine a whole series of results so that people in America begin to actually see dividends from this reorientation. What's been kind of interesting and curious to watch is that this commitment to rebalancing states and markets is a project from on high, but it doesn't seem to have generated much popular enthusiasm at the grassroots. And I think if this begins to yield dividends, which it would do in the second term, it can make an enormous difference. And for the kind of, if we imagine the ship of state being an enormous battleship, it takes a while to turn this battleship around. He needs a second term. I'll give you an example of just how ill-informed the public, or not necessarily ill-informed, but certain things they can't hear. I have a trivia question I ask whoever I talk to about the Biden administration. And the trivia question is, how many infrastructural projects are currently underway? Is $1 trillion package passed and fairly early in his administration? We're now, they say, 3 years into it since money's being dispersed. You want to venture a guess?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to go for a high number, given the way you're framing the question. I would say like 4,000.
You're closer than most, but the number is 42,000 projects.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Individual projects have been funded. Now, some of these are small in the form of couple solar panels on a rural post office that are not going to cost more than 50 to 100 grand. But some of these are enormous, 100, 200 $1 million or more, or $500 million. And no one is aware. Most people guess 4 or 5 projects, and partisanship doesn't matter. I ask conservatives, I ask liberals, I ask radicals, I ask my academic colleagues, I ask the non-academicians I run into. I can't tell you the number of people who across the political spectrum who put the number of projects at 10, 20, 100, which speaks a volume about the failure of the Biden administration to break through.
So it's actually on that, based on this, what you just said, and also your earlier sort of scorecard of how the economy is doing. Why do you think Biden isn't more popular today? Because, one, you could say messaging and so on, but if people have jobs and their wages are going up and the economy is growing, surely just by default, your approval rating should be good, no?
Well, I've been puzzling over this for some time, and it remains something of a mystery to me. In other words, if he was at 42, 45%, I would understand it. But below 40, given the record that he's had, seems confounding to me. I have 3 reasons, but I don't think they're sufficient, but I'll give them to you. One is inflation. This is a population that's had no experience with inflation in 40 years, and given how many young people there are under 40, there's a big section of America that's had no experience with inflation at all. And then suddenly inflation spikes to 8, 9%. And I do think corporations have fully taken advantage of this opportunity to jack up prices. And I can tell you I spend 4 months a year in the US, and I can tell you that my experience going to the supermarket is shocking. I shop probably, when I'm in the US, 4 times a week. I just can't believe the prices. Every time I come home, I start screaming to my spouse about the prices. Now, I'm someone who can afford those increases. Well, I think a lot of Americans can't. And so it hits them where they really hurt. And it hits them. How many times a week do people go to the grocery store, go to the supermarket?
Yeah, there's a salience there,
There's a salience there. It's an immediacy. It hits you in the gut time and time again. This is about feeding your family, feeding your children, no history of this. And even though the inflation rate has gone down dramatically, the prices in the supermarket have not come down. And this is where I think Biden has failed, actually. I think he should have gone after corporations to put pressure on them to show some, given where the inflation rate is now, put some pressure on them to roll back some of those prices. I think this has been a huge issue. And so it leads a lot of people to conclude that I don't have enough money. The economy is not in good shape. So I don't care about all these other infrastructural projects. I know on a daily basis that life is not good. The second issue is immigration and the southern border. And this is a global issue problem. It's being accelerated by the effects of climate, land literally disappearing under the feet of people because it's submerged in water, or areas that had been inhabitable, whether that's North Africa or Central America. You can't grow crops anymore. You got your land, but the land is barren. You can't make a living. And so the pressures to get into the US are enormous. And Biden came into office pledging to be the anti-Trump president on questions of immigration. And Biden was not going to build a wall. And it's not as if he was going to let everyone in, but the Democrats are being a party of the people of color and imagining themselves as a global party in a way in which the Republican Party is not. The Democratic Party ethos on immigration is much more progressive, much more humanitarian, much more open, and they fumbled the issue in the first year or two of the administration. And now there's a genuine crisis on the southern border, and the number, and it's a problem so large that even Trump, even if he builds his concentration camps and builds walls everywhere, is not going to entirely solve. And you know from Britain and its issues, and how many people has the EU persuaded Turkey and Greece to park in their own concentration camps on distant Greek and Turkish islands, right? It's something that's entirely kept out of the news. Progressives have a real lot of difficulty dealing with this issue. And this has become a huge issue in the United States right now. And that is unquestionably hurting Biden. And the third issue is his age. I wish looks wouldn't count for so much, but we live in a visual age. Biden has a look of death about him physically. He, his facial features, the appearance of his face, age has not been kind to him. Too many parts have been frozen into place. I don't think he's lost any more mental capacity than Donald Trump. They're only 3 years apart. I think Biden continues, for the most part, to make good decisions, except on questions of immigration. So I don't think he's lost it mentally, but I think his frailty on the stump, his public appearances, his inability to use the presidency as what Theodore Roosevelt called a bully pulpit. In this visual age, this has certainly hurt him. It's unfair that it's hurt him as much as it has, because people should be judging him most primarily on the quality of the decisions he's made in his administration. The final factor, there's a fourth, and this is foreign policy. I support what he did in connection to Ukraine, but that has become a quagmire. Putin wants to drag this out in Trump's favor because if Trump is in the White House, he's got to get his way in Ukraine, or so he believes. And then the Israel-Palestine conflict is just a terrible, catastrophic situation that no country in the world right now has the ability to solve. And especially among his Democratic supporters, Biden's early support for Israel in that regard has hurt him politically in the U.S. So I mentioned those first three reasons as issues of longstanding: inflation, immigration, his age. And then just in the last few months, Ukraine and Israel-Palestine have certainly hurt him. And that then compounds the age issue, because Americans are now believing there's got to be no quick solution to Ukraine. There's got to be no quick solution to Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine. And how is this man going to be able to handle the challenges that Putin and Netanyahu are throwing his way. And I think more and more Americans are concluding that he won't have the stamina. They will outlast him to America's detriment. So that has hurt him recently.
I mean, one thing I have heard is that, I'm not sure how true this is, but some people have talked about how some of his cabinet, so whether it's Yellen or Blinken, are very powerful, in terms of running policy and running the show, as Biden, given Biden's sort of demeanor. And so in some respects, because his team are capable, almost sort of technocratic, then that's the thing that's kind of keeping the show going, so to speak.
I would say it's keeping the show going in a policy sense. And I think he has a terrific team around him. Blinken, Yellen, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, Gina Raimondo, Commerce Secretary. But every administration needs a public face. And they do, none of them supply that public face. And if Biden himself is not going to supply that public face, then he has to anoint someone else in the administration to do that for him. And that has to be a representation not just of wise policy, but of a profile of strength and power emanating from America to the world. And Trump is able to communicate that projection of power. He's all about projecting power. Does it every minute of the day and night. He's quite good at it. And Biden needs something to balance that in the coming campaign, or he's got to find a surrogate who's capable of doing that for him.
And there has been some talk, some speculation that he may step down ahead of the election and somebody else comes in to replace him, Newsom or somebody else. How much weight do you put to something like that?
Well, the only thing we can say for certain is that there's a lot of concern bordering on panic in Democratic Party circles that Biden is not going to be able to handle the rigors of a campaign, and Democrats are going to lose, and that might put a possible autocrat in the White House. And so there are a lot of people calling for him to step aside. I think it may happen. I don't think it's going to happen soon. I think if it does happen, this is complete conjecture. I have no inside information on this. If it does happen, it will happen at the convention in August, where it will become what party conventions used to be, which is a place for brokering among different constituencies in the party for who was going to get the nod for the nomination. And I can't imagine him saying at that point, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to step aside and I'm going to let the Democrats choose someone else. However, if the Democrats go that way, they cannot have a free-for-all. And the Democratic Party has many churches in it and many, many strong-willed constituencies. And if they start beating each other up, they're going to destroy their chance of winning in November. So in a sense, I'm suggesting the brokering has to occur before the convention, and the convention has to be the demonstration of the results of that brokering. Whether the Democratic Party has enough discipline to bring that off, I don't know.
Is there any historical precedent for such a thing? Sitting president to step down ahead of their next election and be replaced by somebody else?
Well, there is the very dramatic example of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s.
Oh, of course, yeah.
The end of the Vietnam War, and the war was going very badly. And he announces, I think, end of March 1968, that he's got a March 31st, I believe it is. Is there a March 31st or only a March 30th? I think there is a 31st.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah. It's either March 30th or 31st. He announces he's going to be stepping aside. He's not going to run again for the sake of the country. So there is an example of that happening. The difference then is that there was already a prince in waiting by the name of Bobby Kennedy, who had been doing extremely well in the polls. The expectation was that Bobby Kennedy would sweep to victory. That did not happen because he got assassinated after the California primary in June. And then Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president, inherits the mantle. So there was a clearer line of succession. There is not a clear line of succession here. I heard a lot of talk about all the young talent in the Democratic Party, but the the message, and there are, I think it should be a governor, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan would be a good example, or the California governor. But there's a lesson in the Ron DeSantis run for the presidency in the Republican Party, a man who would want an overwhelming re-election in the state of Florida. You would think, what better preparation could that be for a run for the presidency? From the moment he goes national, falls absolutely flat on his face. And this Democrats have to be thinking about that happening to them. A governor, no matter how successful, falling on their face when they are put in the big tent, so to speak. These are things that are impossible to predict, and it should make the Democrats calling for Biden to step aside to be a little more cautious in their calls, because it's not immediately clear that the new candidate would be superior to Joe Biden himself. I also think it's important to give Biden some time to demonstrate, to show whether he can show vigor, once the national campaign starts in vigor, either during the summer months. Give him a chance to see if he can recapture. He'll never be a charismatic candidate, but he had vigor in the 2020 election. And let's see if he can recapture some of that. And then if that doesn't work, then the convention would be the time to do it. Now, Johnson is not a case of this being brokered at the convention. Everything got decided before the convention, but there's a very old practice in American politics of conventions being about brokering candidates and parties going 30 ballots, 40 ballots until they have a nominee. In the famous the infamous 1924 election, they won 103 ballots in an unair-conditioned Madison Square Gardens, the end of June, early July. So it's time, perhaps, for that old convention style to perhaps work some of its magic.
Now, I'm amazed we've gone this far into a conversation without talking a huge amount about Trump. He kind of looms large through all of this. But I did want to kind of talk about Biden, because I think people tend to over-focus on Trump sometimes. So, the first thing that I wanted to ask is Trump's influence on the Republican Party after he lost. Well, after he lost I'm so cautious around the word loss of the election. He did lose the election, but obviously he's claiming he didn't lose the last election. So, how would you kind of describe Trump's journey since the last election, and what's his position in the party today, in the Republican Party?
I would say his position in the party is as strong as it was in 2020. He is the Republican Party now. There's a long history now of Republicans leaving politics, leaving Congress. There's another stream exiting as we speak, because Trump, if they go against Trump, he finds a primary candidate to challenge them in the primary and defeat them in the primary and put an ignominious end to their career. More and more, the party has come to resemble Trump. And for a while during the last 4 years, it was only in the House that the Republicans resembled Trump. This was his base of support. But something very disturbing and alarming happened in the Senate over a bipartisan immigration bill that Republicans and Democrats had spent months putting together. Support for Ukraine and Israel in return for all kinds of restrictions on border crossings that the Democrats swore they would never agree to. They agreed to them. They gave the Republicans almost everything they wanted on this immigration bill. And the moment it was announced, Trump got on the phone to senators and said, "You will not pass this because this is going to harm us. It will deprive us of a critical issue in our election." And a few days later, 3 months of work, a 350-page legislative bill was torched. And I don't think it's coming back. And that shows how deep he's made inroads in the Senate. For a long time, Mitch McConnell, who hates Trump with every fiber in his being, was able to contain Trump's influence in the Senate, even as it kind of ran wild in the House. Senators are elected for 6 terms. It's usually thought that gives them more independence from immediate.
6 years.
Yeah, what did I say?
6 terms.
6 terms. Their terms are 6 years. The terms in the House are 2 years. So House of Representatives delegates feel a lot more constant political pressure. Senators are thought to be more immune from that. And the Republican Senate was more immune. And this latest episode just shows how deeply Trump has made inroads.
And that, even though he lost the general election, even though the midterms, it appeared that his candidates did not do so well. So in effect, the Republicans kind of lost the midterm, so to speak, because of Trump. So in terms of events that tested, his popularity amongst the public, it didn't work. Yet he still has this hold on the party.
Yeah, it's kind of a mystery, but he still has this hold. And usually it's thought if a politician suffers 3 defeats in a row, which Trump, in a sense, has had, 2018 midterms, 2020 election, 2022 midterms, a defeat, you would think that would have ended his magic and his influence. And that's been a rule of American politics for a long time. 3 losses, you're out. The umpire calls you out. And that has not happened in this case. I think that the unknown in this, and this may be hiding a crucial weakness in the Republican Party, and we won't know until the actual election, whether his control of the party is being matched by an exodus of a lot of Republicans from the party, or if they're not exiting the Republican Party, they have already made a decision not to vote for Trump in the general election, as long as they can stomach the Democratic candidate. So it may be that his power is being magnified by the fact that the Republican Party is in fact shrinking to his base of support. He cannot win with his base of support alone. It gives him about 30% of the electorate. He's got to get to 45 or 46% to have a chance of winning in the Electoral College. That is the unknown here. And I would suspect support for him is eroding. And this is what makes Biden's frailty. This is what is driving the Democrats to distraction. They imagine if they had a healthy Democratic candidate, it would be fairly easy to defeat Trump in 2024. But the party every day becomes more his party and a reflection of his wishes. And it's profoundly, to me, distressing to see that happen, to see that development, because the party is losing its independence. And I don't think there's a future for this Republican Party unless it ends in some kind of authoritarian regime.
And from a historical perspective, are there any instances of somebody losing the presidency and then running for the next election? Has that ever happened before? Do they always just disappear into the?
They usually disappear. There's one example, 19th century president Grover Cleveland, who ran for a term, got elected in the late 19th century. Then he did not run for his reelection, and then he came back and ran again. So there is an example of someone taking a term off.
But what was the context for him doing that? Why did he do that?
I just think he had enough of politics for a while, and
okay, simple as that. Yeah, needed a sabbatical.
Needed to take some time off, and it was also a time when the presidency mattered less, and Congress and the Senate mattered more. And so it was a different configuration of power. The power that has accumulated in the presidency now did not exist in the same way in the 19th century for most presidents, except during wartime.
And then the other aspect, obviously, that's very unusual is all these legal cases that are against Trump, in multiple different fronts, election tampering, tax fraud, bribing, this, that, and the other. Well, one question is, how unusual is that? I imagine it's very unusual for, even someone who's lost the election to then later be embroiled in legal cases. Has that ever happened before? And then just in terms of what you think about Trump's current cases.
Well, corruption is certainly not a new phenomenon in American politics. But there's no precedent for this number of cases being brought against a former president. There's also no precedent for a president inciting his supporters to lead an assault on the people's house that he is constitutionally obligated to protect. That has no precedent in American history. I'm writing something on America's possible authoritarian turn, and I'm trying to make sense myself of all the cases brought against Trump. There are currently 6 indictments, 91 counts. And I'm here with my PhD and my years studying American history, trying to keep them all straight and compressible into not an anecdote, but a memo that could be effectively conveyed in a page or two, and it's almost impossible to do. There've got to be a lot of Americans who are just throwing up their hands and saying, well, what are we supposed to do with all this? A couple of the cases are quite serious, and the legal system of the United States is trying to get a handle on Trump and his alleged offenses. I think a couple of the trials that are scheduled will start before the election. We have no idea whether they will conclude with a verdict before the election. But there's no precedent for trying to run a presidential campaign in the midst of someone dealing with 91 indictments across 6 different cases. And it's not clear yet what the larger result is going to be. It may be that the legal system will break Trump and make it impossible for him to win, either through conviction or persuading quite a number of Americans that this man has committed criminal acts and should not be put in the presidency. Or it may be that through the spring, summer, and fall, through delays and weaponizing these court cases and indictments in certain ways, that Trump will end up breaking the American legal system. And a broken legal system is often a path toward an authoritarian regime where the legal system becomes the handmaiden of the executive rather than the legal system being what it should be, which is there to ensure the rule of law rather than men. I cannot tell you at this point which way this is going to turn out, but it makes clear the stakes of this election.
I mean, if Trump does get convicted of something or put into jail, and then at the same time gets elected as president, say, I don't know, like how the sequencing would work, but what happens if you're president? Let me ask a couple of different scenarios here. Let's say you're president. Do your cases stop at that point you become president, or do the cases continue? And then the other question is, let's say he's convicted, put into jail, and gets elected as president. Can you be in jail and also be president or not?
I think technically you can. Eugene Debs, a socialist, was put in jail for opposing. He was a socialist candidate for president, and he was put in jail for speaking critically of World War I. He ran for office as president from jail and got 1 million votes. Now, he wasn't going to get close to the office because he was president. We've never faced this situation before, but I think an actual conviction would not bar someone from running from the presidency, which means someone in prison could be a president of the United States, and that would give the president the authority to appoint the attorney general, to appoint the director of the FBI, and get them to drop all the federal cases against him. So he could, through that mechanism, escape the consequences of his acts. The weakness for Trump are the state cases against him, which he has no control over. And the important one here is the indictment of him for conspiring with a bunch of other people to overturn legitimate election results in the state of Georgia. the person, the chief prosecutor bringing the case against him, which is a very complicated case, is now mired in her own legal trouble for being accused of hiring someone on her staff who she was having an affair with.
Yeah.
And it's not clear that she can continue in this role. So that case, already a complicated case, very difficult to manage, may have been rendered unmanageable. So the state cases would be his kryptonite if he's super. But the source of that kryptonite, it may, I'm losing my metaphor here, but
a couple of different sources.
The kryptonite is maybe in the process of being pulverized, so that it will no longer pose a threat to him.
But it's just so mind-boggling that we're talking about these sorts of things. But you also a number of times have talked about authoritarianism, him being an autocrat and so on. The first term of Trump's presidency, people had the same, there were some fears that he'll become, authoritarian, autocratic, and so on. And while he did violate lots of norms, in the end, there were enough checks and balances to prevent him from being like a so-called third world dictator. This time around, what would be different in that respect? I mean, why are we talking about authoritarianism now?
Well, in 2016, he was a newbie to politics. He understood nothing about the political realm. He had no advisors in place. He had no transition plan. He ended up turning to a lot of Republican establishment figures to run various parts of the government for him. And they were running them in more traditional kind of Republican ways until he got angry and frustrated with them, and he would replace them with someone else. But for a long time, he stuck with people with expertise, demonstrated competence in those areas of governance. In the months leading up to the insurrection, just about all those people abandoned him. They will not go work for him again. Bill Barr is a good example of that, Attorney General. And you could see he was being surrounded more and more by extreme, unstable people like Rudy Giuliani. So I think he would prefer, he now seems to prize loyalty over competence to an even more extreme degree. Much of the Republican establishment that served him in the first term is no longer available to serve. They don't want to have anything to do with him. So I think we're faced with the possibility of very different kind of person having key roles in his administration. And he's got a team of people preparing for this eventuality, now having 4 years of expertise in running the executive branch of the government. And I think he's going to want to move in that direction. Now, it's always hard to know exactly what Trump will do. He's very impulsive, changes his mind often month to month. Could he turn out to be a better president than I'm expecting? Perhaps. On the other hand, it's well documented that he really has no respect for the Constitution, for the rule of law. What he really admires is the rule of strong men, and imagines himself as the embodiment of the people's will, which gives him the authority to rule as he wishes. So I do think the authoritarian peril is very significant. Now, it's also true that America has a very strong legal system, 200 years or more when it's been intact. So, and there will be a major and furious opposition. But there are reasons to be worried.
But on that, the US is kind of famous for its checks and balances, the federal government, states, Congress, president, the executive, Supreme Court, the legal side. Then you have the other side, the military, the press, corporate power. I mean, are they sufficient counterweights to an authoritarian executive?
If he wins and he brings Republican majorities with him in Congress, strikes Congress from that equation, it's not clear whether the Supreme Court will, when push comes to shove, will protect the rule of law against him. I think there are different kinds of indications coming out of the Supreme Court right now. We will know more on whether they allow the indictment of an ex-president to go forward or whether he can still have executive privilege. That will tell us something. So the Supreme Court can possibly stand up against him. I think but may not. And 3 of the Supreme Court justices are his appointees and whom he expects to do his bidding. I worry a lot about the U.S. military. I worry a lot about the Justice Department because I think he's prepared to weaponize those parts of government. I think the real points of resistance will be the states, the blue states, the northern states, the big states, especially places like New York, California. Those will be areas that Trump will not be able to control. And that's where I think if you're looking for a separation of powers, it's going to be the difficulty of conquering the landscape of the United States because you have 50 state governments that have independent authority to a certain point over their territory. And this was deliberate on the part of the framers and the founding fathers to make it much more difficult to roll out a national policy in the U.S. because you've got to go across this variegated terrain where you have all these governments and governors who don't owe anything to you and have an independent base of support. So if there's got to be a base of resistance from within the government, I think it's the place to look is if he gets elected in a Democratic Congress, Congress will become a point of resistance. And I would like to think that when push comes to shove, if he acts on his authoritarian tendencies, that the Supreme Court stands up for the rule of law in America. But the Supreme Court is a heavily partisan institution and deeply embroiled in the politics of this moment.
I mean, historically, have we had any presidents who have had huge amounts of power? For example, like FDR presumably had a lot of power because he was around during wartime, so suddenly the executive accumulates a lot of power. I mean, so are there instances where you had a lot of power accumulated, around the executive or the president? So at least that's one parallel. Now, what they did with that is a separate question. But are there some kind of reference points we have?
America was at war for much of the 20th century, and during wars, power accumulates in the executive. And I think with both Republican and Democratic presidents, too much power has accumulated. And this was probably even more true on the whole of Democratic presidents in the 20th century and Republican presidents, for the simple fact that it was Democrats who were in office during the major wars, World War I, World War II, certainly for much of the stretch of the first half of the Cold War, the Republican Eisenhower years accepted in that regard. So there have been struggles in the executive over how much power it should have relative to other branches of government. There's also no doubt that the executive, because of so much war and also the war on terror since 2001, has continued to accumulate power to a very high extent. So there's certainly a pattern here. I think what worries me about Trump is that other presidents, when push came to shove, have had a respect for the Constitution and the framework of government that America had. And I don't see that in Trump. I'd like to be surprised if he wins in 2024 for him showing that to me, but I don't see that. If we think of the way Nixon left office on the verge of his impeachment in the early 70s, can't imagine Trump doing that. He understood it at some level that he was not going to win this, that it might bring shame on the republic, that it might undermine the constitutional system. These are ideas and thoughts that don't animate Trump, which is why it makes this moment, to my way of thinking, more dangerous than earlier moments.
Well, on that somewhat sort of somber note, let's wrap up this conversation. I know we could go on for longer. Fantastic to speak to you. What's the best way for people to follow you, by the way?
Twitter at GL Gerstle is my handle, and your podcast.
Great. No, appreciate that. Yeah. Well, good luck with everything, with your research and your new book that you'll be working on. And I do urge people to read your last book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.